Hello, and thanks for joining us. I'm Amy Pendergrass with Moss Adams, and I'm going to get us started for today's session, Incorporate Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Values. The presentation you are about to see isn't legal, investment, or accounting advice. We encourage you to seek the counsel of a professional service provider to apply this content to your specific circumstances. And now I'm going to play a brief housekeeping video.
Welcome, and thanks for joining us. We're pleased to present another in our ongoing series of continuing professional education webcasts to help companies and individuals conquer challenges as they plan for what's next. Our presentation will start in a few moments. Before we begin, here are a few things to keep in mind. You can customize how you both view our presentation and interact with the presenter. For better viewing, close all other applications and turn up your speaker volume. You can also adjust window size and placement, or enter full screen mode using the controls at the top of the window or dragging the bottom right-hand corner to resize. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a series of icons, each relating to a different aspect of our session. You can download the group attendance sheet and a PDF copy of today's slides from the slide deck and handouts widget to the right of the slide view. You can ask our presenter questions during the webcast by typing a question in the Q&A window below the slide view and clicking Submit. We'll do our best to answer all questions during the presentation or follow up via email. If you experience technical difficulty during today's presentation, refresh your browser by hitting the F5 key.
Today's webcast is eligible for 1.5 CPE credits per the National Association of State Boards of Accountancy. To qualify for these credits, you must attend for a minimum of 75 minutes and respond to at least 5 of the 6 polling questions. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Colleen Rozillis, Moss Adams partner and leader of our Environmental, Social, and Governance Services to get the session started. Colleen?
Great. Thank you so much, Amy. Hello to everyone and welcome, and thank you for joining us. I'm really excited for our discussion today. We have an incredible panel of diversity, equity, and inclusion leaders, and you'll get to hear from leaders across higher education and the not-for-profit world. So I'm very pleased to introduce them to you all today. We have Brenda Hodges, the CFO of the Meyer Memorial Trust. Erwin Acox Jr., he's the Director of Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion from Tides. Vock, who's the Senior Vice President of Business Affairs and the CFO of the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Kevin James, he's the Dean of the Willie Deese College of Business and Economics at North Carolina A&T State University. And Michelle Purnell-Hepburn, she's the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Director of the Seattle Foundation. And then I'm your moderator. I'm Colleen Rozillis. I'm a partner with Moss Adams. I lead our ESG practice, as well as I'm the consulting leader for our public sector, not-for-profit, and tribal industry group. So I'd really, again, like to thank everyone for joining us for our panel discussion today. DEI is an incredibly important topic in all organizations. We're looking forward to learning more about how everyone here is incorporating DEI into our organization, into our daily operations, into governance. Before we dive into the panel, the format of today's discussion, just to give everyone an idea of what to expect, we're going to take a few moments. I've introduced these folks at a high level. They are going to be the best ones to actually tell you about themselves, so we'll let them briefly introduce themselves and talk a little bit about their backgrounds and their organizations. I'm going to kick off the conversation asking some questions, just some high-level themes and things that we know everyone wants to learn about. If you have questions you'd like to ask our panelists, you can submit them using the Q&A box. Our panelists are going to be covering a lot of information today. If we're unable to address your questions, we'll follow up with you after today's session. Our goal really is that whatever your role is across whatever industry, that you'll come away with a new idea, a fresh perspective, something that you can apply in your organization. And we look forward to having an authentic and interactive conversation with you all. So first, we want to hear who's here with us today. Amy, if you wouldn't mind launching our first polling question.
All right, so the first polling question is, what type of not-for-profit organization do you represent? A, foundation, grant-making, B, healthcare, C, higher education, D, social service, E, research institution, F, trade association, or G, other. And the polling questions will show up on the slides, so make sure you have the slide window open. And we'll give you a few moments to respond. To respond, please click the button next to the answer you choose and hit submit. And I see quite a few coming in through the Q&A window. In order to qualify for CPE, you do need to submit it via the slide. And make sure you hit the submit button. And we'll leave this up for another 5 seconds or so. Okay, here are the results.
All right, so we've got a lot of folks in higher ed, a lot of folks in the foundation space. Well, that makes sense because we have a lot of folks on the panel in higher ed and foundation grant making today, so that's good. The majority of people are from other industries, so I think that that's good because, you know, everything that we talk about is applicable across every industry and every organization. And so while we've got these professionals from not-for-profit and mission-driven organizations, we know that equity and inclusion and diversity are really values that apply across every organization. So our hope is that you can take away something that applies no matter what your industry is, and put those questions right into the box if you've got them. All right, so let's get to know our panelists just a little bit more. And Brenda, we're going to start with you. If you wouldn't mind telling us just a little bit about yourself and tell us about your organization.
Good morning, everyone. Pleasure to be here. My name is Brenda Hodges, and I am the Chief Financial Officer at Meyer Memorial Trust. A bit about myself. I grew up on a farm in Nebraska and moved to Oregon 23 years ago, where I'm raising 2 kids with my husband. I've not always been an accountant and actually started my career as a Spanish translator. I've spent nearly two decades in accounting and finance with the last 8 years at Meyer. Meyer is a private foundation in Oregon that was established 40 years ago, actually this year, by Fred G. Meyer. Some of you may recognize him as the founder of the Fred Meyer grocery store chain. Our equity journey began over 10 years ago, and it has not been without hard lessons, and it has taken the commitment from every level of the organization, from trustees to leadership to staff. Again, I'm honored to be here today and look forward to learning and sharing with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brenda. Erwin, over to you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Erwin Acox. Here earlier, I am originally from Chicago and have lived in the San Francisco Bay Area for the past 5 years now. I am the Jedi Director at TIES, where I've worked for almost 5 years now. I have officially been working in a DEI capacity for over a decade, excuse me, but have unofficially worked on DEI issues for nearly 20 years now. Prior to TIES, I was Chief of Diversity at the Illinois Department of Transportation, which is the 3rd largest DOT in the country. TIES is a philanthropic partner and a nonprofit incubator. And we have a vision of fostering a world of shared prosperity and social justice through our partnerships and through our work and how we work internally and externally. Our DEI journey has been off and on for several years now. In its most recent form, we're really seeking to accelerate our progress and become more of a force multiplier in the space. But of course, we're continuing to pay close attention to our internal climate and culture to ensure that we continue to infuse DEI or JEDI throughout everything we do. Very excited to be here, everyone.
Thank you so much. Jean?
Good morning, everyone. I'm Jean Vock. I'm the Senior Vice President for Business Affairs, which is also the Chief Business and Financial Officer for the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, UNLV. I originally grew up in the Midwest, born in Minnesota, and did my formative years in Wisconsin, but I moved to the desert Southwest to get away from those cold winters. Most of my career, I've been in public service and higher education. And before joining UNLV, I spent several years at the University of Arizona in Tucson. What I love about being in the higher education space is that there's always an ongoing quest for knowledge and discovery and justice as well. This is something I've really found. And since I've been with UNLV, this institution has consistently ranked as one of the most diverse institutions by U.S. News and World Report. The Campus Ethnic Diversity Ranking identifies colleges where students are most likely to encounter other undergraduates from racial or ethnic groups different from their own. UNLV is currently placed in a four-way tie for first place with this most recent publication, and has been in those rankings for over 5 years. More than 65% of UNLV's undergraduate students identify as a member of a racial or ethnic minority. In 2020, UNLV appointed its first Black president, Keith E. Whitfield, and that's in over 63 years of history. We're continually trying to do more to promote diversity and equity and inclusion and belonging. And we feel it's very much part of our mission and it's part of our strategic plan. We really truly believe that our student diversity is one of our biggest assets, and that when we create a place with more diversity, there's better learning. So I'm really pleased and proud to be part of this organization, and over the course of this session, hope to share more about what we're doing at UNLV.
Thank you, Jean. Kevin, over to you.
All right. Good morning or afternoon. Kevin James. So I started my career actually in public accounting with Pricewaterhouse, now PricewaterhouseCoopers. So did that for a few years until I decided to go back and get my doctorate so I could enter into higher education. So I got my doctorate from University of Tennessee. And I've now been in academia for about 22 years. Started my career at Middle Tennessee State. I'm actually from Murfreesboro, Tennessee, outside of Nashville. So started my career at MTSU for 10 years, and then came over to North Carolina A&T, where I've been for the last 12. 7 of those years as Department Chair for Accounting and Finance, and the last 5 years in the role of Dean. North Carolina A&T is a historically Black university. So we are one of approximately 107 HBCUs in the country. We are the largest HBCU in the country, actually, and by many rankings and accounts, the #1 HBCU in the country. So proud of that. The Deese College, our College of Business and Economics, is the highest ranked business college at a public HBCU. Our university serves about 13,300 students. My business college serves about 1,800 students.
Thank you, Kevin. And Michelle, would you like to take us home? Michelle, you might be on mute.
Let me try that again. Greetings, everyone. Michelle Purnell-Hepburn, representing the Seattle Foundation as its Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Director. We are the oldest community foundation in Seattle, established 75 years ago. And my career trajectory also started in finance and accounting, where I was in financial institutions, not-for-profit financial institutions called credit unions for most of my career, and decided to jump over into nonprofit accounting, and started as a controller of the Seattle Foundation in June of 2013, moving into the DEI directorship in 2020. Seattle Foundation prides itself in where we can pride ourselves in as the heart and science of philanthropy, community philanthropy, and our racial equity journey truly started when we had a program called Neighbor to Neighbor, which I'm proud to say just celebrated 30 years in 2021. And our board has shifted, our management team has shifted more toward equity within the last 7 to 8 years, starting with our senior racial equity advisor, Alice Ito, and then my coming on in 2020. I look forward to sharing all of the journey, the pitfalls, as well as the boons that we have, that we continue to work on. And I turn it back over to you, Colleen. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you all for sharing a little bit about yourselves and your careers. I love hearing how many of you grew up in cold places and moved to warm places, just like me. So I think that's something we can all bond on a little bit later. All right, so we're going to start. There's a question actually that everyone is extremely interested in, I think, from attendees to all of you. So we're going to start, Kevin, if you wouldn't mind starting us off with this one, which is what recommendations do you have for helping an executive team, including the CEO, define their commitment to DEI and set the tone for the organization, or begin to model DEI for the organization?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, so obviously there are several stakeholders to consider in approaching this question. I think one of the most important, personally, is employees. How your employees respond and whether they buy in really has a deep impact on whether you can recruit talent, whether you can retain talent. Does a lot to set your culture. But just as important, I think, these are the folks who are your primary missionaries, right? They're going to be the ones who are sharing the good news or the not so good news of just how committed you really are in this space, and whether you're just giving lip service to whatever it is you're trying to do. So I think really, the recommendation is knowing your employees, taking the time to do the work to really understand. When we talk about equity or we talk about inclusion, it doesn't mean the same thing. That term doesn't mean exactly the same thing to everyone. So really understanding the perspectives of your employees and what it means to them, and working with young people on a day-to-day basis. I think that's especially critical for our younger employees and people who are coming into our organizations. And I think that Gen Xers, Boomers, those of us who are often in charge, we tend to frame questions and solutions out of our own experiences and our perspectives, and that's just kind of human nature. But as an organization that's training the folks who you're going to be hiring over the next 5 years, they just seem to think very differently, particularly in this whole ESG space. And they are very willing, without even really thinking about it, very willing to make life-changing decisions based on what they perceive as a commitment to some of these principles. And so I think it takes, with respect to the younger generation, I think it takes a high level of empathy and just thinking about trying to understand what their perspectives really are, so that can be factored into the framing of how we define that commitment. And I'll say this one more, I'll leave this one additional point on this question. The generation, consider that the generation of folks who are going to be coming into our companies and organizations over the next 5 years, 10 years, they've experienced these events over the last couple of years: the murder of George Floyd, the inequities that were revealed by the pandemic, the racial justice movement. They've experienced these things from a different vantage point than those of us who are Xers or Boomers. We've had set perspectives, and certainly those events were powerful enough to shift our perspectives, but it didn't shift their perspective. It set their perspective, right? Because they experienced it at a very formative time. So it will have really set the perspective, and that's what they anchor on. And so for them, it's just life. It's just the way they think in many cases. And so I think that's a bit different, and I think that has implications for how we move forward in this space.
Kevin, thank you so much for sharing that. I really appreciate that you led with this idea of we have to build a common understanding of what we mean by DEI, and then you actually showed that you were working to build that common understanding with people who were different from you, and really leading with empathy. That's a really incredible answer. Michelle, can you share from a community foundation's perspective? And I know with respect to your executive team, you just announced a new CEO last week, so you probably have some fresh perspective there.
Yes, we did. I always say you have to start with the what. What do you want? We so often jump into how are we going to get from X to Y. But first you have to have the vision. What kind of organization do you want to have? Our former CEO, soon after George Floyd was killed, said that he wanted our organization to become an anti-racist organization. He said this full stop. He said this at an all-hands meeting. And my first question was, do you realize what you're saying, as well as how big an ask that is? However, he started the wheels turning for all of us of how could we do this? And so the next question I would have to ask is how transparent the leader wants to be. Because in order to get to that arc of anti-racism, there's a lot of transparency that has to happen. And that leader and the leadership team need to be on the same page as we march on that path. Thank you.
Transparency. Yeah, definitely. We see that in so many organizations as a huge piece that is lacking once we define that one. Thank you, Michelle. Brenda, do you have any insights to add from the trust experience as a younger organization?
Sure. One of the things that we have talked about is a level of openness and readiness. That doesn't mean that you're 100% ready, but to what Michelle and Kevin described, it takes time and commitment outside of your traditional responsibilities, and having intentional time set aside for this work is super important. And that's not just at the executive level, it's at the board level, it's at the staff level. But being able to approach this work with a level of openness to know that, one, you're going to have to grow personally. This is not just an organizational movement. This is something that, depending on your own lived experience, this will have a significant impact on the work that you do in the organization. So being able to devote the time and set aside the time is super important. The other piece of it is having appropriate resources. So oftentimes when you start this work, you might do it in a grassroots level. So you might rely on staff to lead some of these things. And what we found at Meyer was it was really important to hire subject matter experts so that staff could fully participate, be fully committed to their own growth and learning, and so that they weren't being burdened with having to lead some of those conversations. And I speak from a very privileged philanthropic space when I say this next point, which is that it does cost money to be able to devote resources to this. It's very important. We definitely see the value in that internally, and we also have offered that with our community partners when doing our funding as well, is to make sure that we are seeing that as a commitment to the community. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, I think adding capacity, when you have it in your organization already, really identifying then what you can take off of people's plates is a huge piece of this as well, and not just continuing to burden individuals who might have those skills, but then identifying where can we look outside to really be able to make a difference is something that organizations have been doing, and that's a great lesson learned. Erwin, your organization is a partner and incubator for a lot of other mission-driven entities. So what insights do you have from your executive team's experience, which is pretty unique?
Great, thanks for that. It's a ongoing conversation. For us, this all started with my hire in 2017, which was the first role focused on DEI at Tides. And then, from there, it really started with listening to the employees at Tides and really hearing about their lived experience. And from there, we really spoke truth to power at the executive and the board level, which for us led to the board of making a focus on DEI part of our CEO's annual priorities, which wasn't there before. it led to the board crafting their own statement, which then showed that they were modeling their commitment. And then as the DEI lead, all of us should always have direct access to the other executives, including the CEO. And it starts with getting to know that executive team and really building an authentic connection with them to help you get clarity on their understanding and their personal commitment to DEI. This will help you align on an understanding of DEI and your executive's vision for the organization, including the CEO. I also help our execs really set the tone by giving them feedback and sharing things that I learned through our various feedback channels. And then from there, I provide some recommendations on how modeling aligned behaviors around DEI might look. And for me, approaching the work in this way really opened up the opportunity for the organization to create its first Office of Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, which I now lead. And our CEO, who's just been with us over a year now, she entered the organization really championing DEI, or JEDI as we call it. And so she's also been my chief advocate and the chief model for the work throughout the organization. And so it's become very clear at Ties that JEDI is at the center of all the work we do. It's how we operate in everyday life, and it's how we will continue to operate throughout the rest of our existence. And so I've been very fortunate to now have a CEO who's truly committed on a personal level and throughout her career, who really supports the work and models the principles of that work in her daily interactions with all of us.
You covered every single facet of your organization, employees, board, executives in that answer. So that's a gold star right there. I also really appreciate you bringing up this idea of actually giving folks feedback about what inclusive behaviors look like, because we often get feedback from folks about, okay, I have great intentions. I want to do the right thing. I don't know what that looks like. And then they get stuck. And that's where initiatives often fail. So that's incredible that your organization is doing that. I think we could learn a lot from that. Okay, Jean, you're last up. I know your executive cabinet has really been working on DEI in a lot of different ways. How has your cabinet been working on that and setting the tone?
Yes, thank you. And just appreciated all the answers. Sorry about that. Of course, I forgot to turn. So yeah, our cabinet and our leadership has really been very active. We hired a vice president for diversity, equity, and inclusion starting in 2017 was the first time. And that person retired recently, and we've got an active search going on right now. That is a cabinet level position. What we have done is, I know everyone's talked about, you got to allocate the resources. You got to look, when you look at your budget, you determine your priorities. So we have created a cabinet level positions and staffed that office to provide support for the initiatives that we're undergoing. One of the things we did 3 or 4 years ago was it's called the Idi Profile, and what that is an assessment for the perceived and actual level at which we are actually recognizing where we are in our development orientation scores. So there's the perceived orientation score is what we think how we are at capability at understanding and adapting to cultural differences. And the development orientation score tells us where we actually are. And that assessment gave us this measurement that told us we actually have some significant gaps in what we perceive where we are and where we actually are. That gave us a roadmap to help to really start focusing on development opportunities. And those include working with the Anti-Defamation League's program. They have a program called Hate Uncycled. all of the cabinet and all of the deans and senior leadership are either have completed or are going through that program to increase our awareness. We have highlighted the importance of diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice into our strategic plan. And there's numerous initiatives across the campus that we're doing to help foster and promote the social justice, equity, and inclusion. We have ways to go. We've made progress, but we do definitely have more places to go. So I think we're excited about the progress we've made, but we are also really clearly developing a roadmap for where we need to go.
Thank you, Jean. I heard a lot of, prioritizing and investing in it, which is really important, and signaling to the rest of the campus community that that's what you're doing. Thank you all so much for answering that question. I know folks are very interested in the answer to that one. So Amy, can you pop up another poll for us?
Yes, so the second polling question is, what brings you to today's webinar? A, I want to take lessons back to my colleagues or organization. B, I want to learn more about operationalizing racial equity. C, I'm not sure where to begin on operationalizing racial equity. Or D, all of the above. And then just a reminder that if you do want CPE for today's webcast, you will need to respond to at least 5 of the 6 polling questions. It's pulled back up again. Sorry about that. Looks like someone may have advanced it. So we'll leave this up here to give you time to respond. All right, here are the results.
All right, well, all of the above, not a surprise to me. And speaking of operationalizing, that's what our next question is about. So we'll start with Brenda. Brenda, what's your organization doing to embed and implement DEI policies and procedures into your organizational culture?
Thanks, Colleen. So 2 areas came to mind. Being the person that oversees the IT and operations and finance, it's easy sometimes for folks in the middle, as I like to say, not feel as connected to the work because they're not doing that work every day. They're doing more compliance related. And so we had a very intentional practice. We, in the beginning of our work, set up subcommittees from our equity committee, and included emerging issues, ongoing learning. But one of the areas was around human resources. So the group went through and tackled many projects. It was a very successful grassroots effort. And a couple of the things that they accomplished was reassessing job requirements. And what the goal of that was to lift up relevant experience versus relying on traditional educational and certification requirements. Looking through and saying, is the experience just as valid as, say, a degree is? And so going through and taking a look at that across the organization. The other thing that came from this work was listing salary ranges within the job posting. So no one needs to guess coming in what it is that they're going to be potentially making. And I'm seeing that more practiced, even just throughout other industries. And so just would advocate that that's hugely important in folks coming in to work for you, because it signals to them that you are willing to have a level of transparency. The other thing that we do as an organization is that we embed the DEI objectives within our annual performance reviews. So as what Jean was speaking about earlier about measuring ourselves, and the idea is not to say, where are you at today, but where do you want to go? So it's twofold. And so it's good to take inventory, but it's also important to set goals for yourself. And so those are talked about ongoing throughout the year. The other piece that I want to touch on around operationalizing is we had noted that on the grant making side, we ask our potential grantees to fill out a diversity, equity, inclusion spectrum tool. It's on our website, happy to share it with the group if there's interest. And we saw that as an opportunity to ask the same of any potential external partners. And so I'll give the example, since we're, Moss Adams is hosting this today. When we did an audit RFP, we put a portion of the RFP devoted to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And one of the aspects was to fill out the spectrum tool. And the tool aims to assess where an organization is on the DEI journey and then identifies potential areas for future work. So the idea is not to say you get a pass or a fail, but just it starts a dialogue, and it's really important. And it also signals to our external partners that this is not a transaction. This is a relationship, and these are the things that are important to us. We seek value alignment, and with that, we ask them to share in that process what are some of the initiatives that you are carrying in your organization. And we also ask them to share demographics. It's something that we list on our website, and so we ask for those potential questions as well. It doesn't end there. It's not a one and done. If you're an external partner, you're in a relationship with us. And so on an annual basis, for example, with the audit, part of the financial statement audit presentation with the board includes circling back to these topics. It could be a follow-up to a prior year, or it could be sharing something new. And the idea that this is an ongoing commitment, and we're learning from each other in this process. So those are just a couple things that we do to operationalize the work.
Thank you, Brenda. I like that you hit on a lot of internal services there. HR and procurement are two of the big ones, and thinking about your supply chain and your partnerships and diversifying those, but also having that conversation with your valued partners and continuing that. I think that's a really great lesson to share with everyone that's here today. Jean, I'd love to hear about, from your perspective in the Business Affairs Office, you have a lot of different functions under you, and how all of those policies and procedures have been implemented.
Thank you, Colleen. Within our division, the Business Affairs Division, which is approximately 500 people, at every staff meeting, I reinforce the resources available to our employees, and I encourage them to take advantage of these opportunities. That we, in addition to our employee relations team and our Title IX office, we also have an Ombuds Office, which is really kind of a little bit more informal. There's no formal intake forms, but it helps people to talk through whether or not this is something that they need to go through a reporting process. So we do reinforce and continually encourage people, if you see something, say something. We can't address issues unless you bring it to our attention. So that's a really, I think, important, making a safe space for reporting concerns. And they also need to see that their concerns are being addressed, that we're responding to those, and that has been happening. Another, really an institutional effort, is the Search Advocate Program. It's designed to support the search and hire process for all of our units across campus, and it has three priorities: to increase the diversity of our candidate pools, ensure equitable practices and treatment throughout the search process, and ensure that the human resources and Title IX offices participate in the search and follow that all of our search and hire policies and practices are in compliance. Now, we didn't develop this ourselves. Our program is modeled after one developed at Oregon State University. And so we've partnered with them. We're currently in the process of, we've hired a coordinator for this, and we're training search advocates and participating in having search advocates participate in more and more of our searches. I shared earlier that while that we are the most diverse institution, or tied for the first place for the most diverse institution, and that is for our students. But across our faculty and some of the other areas of staffing, we're not as diverse. We want our entire community of the university to reflect the diversity of our community and of our student body. So those are just a few of the things that we're doing.
Thanks, Jean. you mentioned at the beginning those employee resources, really with that aim of creating psychological safety for your team, which is so important as part of this. Erwin, what do you have to share in terms of what you're working on with policies and procedures for JEDI at Tides?
So at Tides, again, I'm fortunate to have a strong commitment at all levels of the organization. So I have a strong partnership with our Chief People Officer, HR Director, our talent lead, et cetera. And we have just completed our most recent climate assessment to help us get a real clear picture on whether our policies and procedures are aligning with JEDI. And we used an external vendor for that because, as you can imagine, if we're doing these ourselves internally, we carry a certain bias where we want our organizations to look good. Even as practitioners, we may do that. So we wanted this passionate third party to really come in and just review all of our policies, observe our rituals and practices, and they also conducted some focus groups to really understand what our current climate is and provide us with some insights and recommendations for action. They spoke directly to the majority of employees. They reviewed nearly 100 documents in our organization and really helped me see opportunities where Tides could shift our policies in a way that support staff across the board. One major policy change we made that I like to share is paying our employees a living wage. So we operate across 22 states, and mainly in New York and San Francisco. And as all of us know, in those places, it's very costly to live. And we realized that we had some folks that really weren't making enough to sustain themselves. And so we raised their salaries to a point where they could actually do that. And so we had some folks who were, say, for example, were making maybe $55,000 living in San Francisco, and we raised that up to $75,000. And that's just an initial step for us as we continue to look at our salaries and our policies around that. We're also negotiating a union contract with staff, which will help us ensure that there are policies in place that codify Tides' commitment to JEDI. And so these are both very important undertakings that will also inform our multi-year JEDI strategy going forward. And for us, we wanted to get a pulse of our current climate. Tides has experienced quite a bit of change and growth over the last 4.5 years, and we realized that the climate has shifted. It's different than it was when I came in 2007. So it's important that we as practitioners really work hard to not be prescriptive, using practices that we've always used or learned previously. Instead, we have to always work to keep an accurate pulse on the organization as it is now, on the current climate. This will also help us address things in real time as they come up instead of allowing them to fester, because we're not keeping an accurate pulse on the culture and the climate in the organization. And again, I'm also fortunate to have leaders that are values aligned and actually have an understanding of JEDI. That's really helped a lot too.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I really appreciate that you called out pay equity as part of equity as well. I think that's so important for us all to remember that it's not just about the day-to-day, how we operate with each other culturally, but also about that, what happens when people go home, what happens with their paychecks. So thank you, Erwin. Amy, can we pull up our third polling question, please?
Okay, our third polling question, where on the DEI continuum would you describe your organization's progress? Just starting to dip our toes, B, emerging, C, on the right path, D, leading the way, or E, none of the above? And while you're answering that, I do want to let you know that we are recording this webcast and we'll send out a copy via email tomorrow. I know a lot of you are interested in sharing this with your team, so do expect that tomorrow. We'll leave this up for another 5 seconds. Okay, Colleen, here are the results.
Okay, so we've got a pretty even spread. We've got On the Right Path as the leader here. We've got a minority focusing we're leading the way, and that's not a surprise. It probably organizations that were leading the way had been leading the way before 2020, right? And a lot of our clients just started really investing in DEI just a couple of years ago. And so we're seeing a lot of organizations just really trying to feel their way recently. So thank you all for sharing this. This is a really insightful question. All right, so Jean, you mentioned in your last answer that your faculty and staff, they might not reflect the diversity of your student population, which I think is something that a lot of organizations, particularly in higher education and in the public and social sectors, really struggle with this, reflecting the communities that we serve. So thinking about that, how are you and your team working to define and working to change your dominant workplace culture? So not just how we look, but also those cultural norms and behaviors that might be those unspoken barriers to equity and inclusion in the workplace.
Thank you. We are doing, again, a number of things trying to make those changes. Part of it is through the cultural standards that we've established, and we are incorporating that into everyone's job description, that they're expected to uphold the standards that we've established for our organizational behavior, the way we behave and the way we serve our customers across campus. And so we do hold people accountable. We're trying to create more opportunities and build the pipeline so that there are more people that are eligible to be considered for new opportunities and promotions. I think those are probably kind of the key things that we're doing and focusing in those areas.
When you are talking about establishing cultural standards and building them into job descriptions, so when you had to establish those cultural standards, what were those conversations like?
We had a very comprehensive effort to establish that. It was all of these business units and HR employees. We about 500 employees, over 200 were involved in the discussions. One of the things that was really exciting relates to one of our best programs here, which is our College of Hospitality, which is known for really the service industry. We hired a professor that has deep experience in the service industry because we are service units, and that professor helped us facilitate all of these conversations. And through those conversations, we captured an incredible amount of feedback, and then she synthesized the feedback, and it's across all areas of service, but it definitely including what is the culture we want to create in this division. And then we are talking about rolling this out throughout campus. And it's embodied in what we call the CARE standards, with the C standing for collaboration, A for acknowledgement, R for respect, and E for empowerment. That kind of is the high level of our culture standards here. But then within that, we have a set of universal standards that address a number of those key areas that we expect everyone to adhere to. And then we have further standards for each of the areas within our division. We've had every employee sign a statement acknowledging that they understand that these are the standards to which they'll be held accountable, and that is now incorporated into the annual evaluation process. we're about 2.5 years in, and we've just formed a group to revisit those standards. And we're finding, that we missed the mark a little bit on how we structured some of these. So let's go and do a refinement. And that process is underway, and it's something we'll probably do every 2 to 3 years. We'll do a review and a refinement of our cultural and climate standards that we have for our division.
That is fantastic. So you establish them and you understand that your culture is a living, breathing, evolving thing, and you are continuing to update that. That's really great to hear. Michelle, can you share from the Seattle Foundation's perspective how you're working on your dominant workplace culture?
Yes, I am pleased to say that in the last 4 years, Seattle Foundation has moved from a all-white identified leadership team with a male CEO to an all-female leadership team that is 66% BIPOC. This is extreme progress, especially for an organization whose donors are predominantly white and whose wealth was predominantly built on the backs of Black and brown people. How do we do this? Well, it first takes courage to speak truth to power, and also help decide what the culture is now and what do we want to be, and willing to breathe through the blowback, because there will be blowback. Creating a vision of belonging, what does that look like? And also proving how success is achieved when everyone is raised and expected to be at their best. Encouraging colleagues to get used to being uncomfortable. I cannot stress this enough. It is going to be uncomfortable at times, and not to say because I'm uncomfortable, I need to stop, or if I'm uncomfortable, I need to walk away or get angry, is to breathe. Because it is when we're uncomfortable that change happens. And it takes patience. Patience is critical. We don't want quick fixes. We want solutions that will last, because we're making decisions not only for this generation, our current employees, but the next generation and 7 times 7 generations from now. What that looks like in practice is our affinity groups, our DEI council, speaking with our leadership team, getting buy-in on ideas. Now leadership team is coming to us, asking for our opinions on where the organization needs to go and what needs to be done. And that's a huge shift. And I'm so very proud of that, as well as proud of our board had the courage to select a Black woman to lead this organization. And she starts in May, and couldn't be more thrilled. Yes, could not be more thrilled. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. I appreciate that you shared especially that thing about discomfort, because so many folks are afraid to feel uncomfortable in the moment, and then we don't make a lot of progress because of that. And 5 minutes of discomfort is absolutely worth a decade of a better organizational culture, for sure. All right, Amy, I think it's time for us to ask our audience another CPE poll.
Okay, so we have our 4th polling question. Where do you feel your organization's DEI efforts need the most attention? A, improving employee engagement. B, fostering an inclusive environment. C, addressing, looks like someone moved that. All right, C, addressing unconscious bias, or D, developing allyship. And while you're responding, I do want to remind you that if you're attending today's webcast in a group setting, you do need to make sure you fill out the group attendance sheet located in your console. And everyone's pretty quick to answer this one, so we'll leave it up for a few more seconds here. All right, here you go.
All right. Unconscious bias is the winner here. Yeah, that's something that many organizations are working on and really digging into and thinking about how that bleeds into things that we've talked about a lot already, like policies and procedures, like our dominant workplace culture. Like Erwin mentioned, doing a climate assessment, having a third party take a look at your policies and procedures and how you operate can be a real benefit to identifying those areas where you have unconscious bias in the operating areas of your organization. So yeah, very interesting results. Okay, so next up, Erwin, we've got a question for you. How do you approach getting buy-in from your colleagues when you're trying to develop DEI strategies?
Great question. So I always focus on building authentic relationships first, and from there, that helps create the space for us to co-create a future together. In 2018 and 2019, I was sponsored by one of our execs. This is prior to becoming director of JEDI. I was sponsored by one of our execs to conduct a people and culture listening tour to really hear about the experience that each employee was having in our organization. It's about a 6-month process, and we heard some hard truths, but we actually acted upon what we heard. And this in itself helped us really get buy-in, because every stakeholder, being those folks impacted by the culture or the climate, they were able to show up and operate with agency and really lend their voices to that process. During that process, we realized that we hadn't had any cultural or organizational values for how we would operate internally, right? And so through hearing from each employee at the time who was here, we collectively came up with this set of 5 values. And we were able to galvanize folks around those values, because we also included examples of what it would look like if you lived into these values every day. Posted them throughout the entire office so that when folks were having meetings, they could see those values on the wall, along with the descriptors. And we still operate on those values today. And so with our most recent assessment just coming to a close, we'll take this same approach to ensure that we've listened and are taking action where we can.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I was at a client site a few weeks ago, and it was, similar. When all else fails, just put it on the wall, right? If you have to walk past it 100 times a day, then you can learn it by osmosis, right? Thank you so much. Kevin, how about in your institution, thinking about getting buy-in from your colleagues?
Yeah, so for me, leading our unit, much of it is education and messaging over time. It's making sure that that what people are hearing from me is the same thing that they're hearing from department heads, and that they're consistently hearing the message of this being an important piece of what we're doing. And then the other part is, I think, Michelle alluded to this in a little bit different setting or sense, but patience, like understanding that we're talking about a set of people who have set perspectives that have been learned over a lifetime, and that in some cases it just takes a little patience to get the buy-in that you're looking for. I think, from my perspective, one of the most important things is tying DEI initiatives to like broader business strategy, like what it is, what your purpose is. And part of what that does is to kind of take it out. I think the weight of political voices, perspectives have become so strong in this area that some people's minds immediately go to that space, and that it's necessary for us to be intentional about sort of wresting it out of the political sphere and putting it in our business sphere and in our business context. And I'll give a couple of examples. So one is from the perspective of a board of an organization that I sit on, and with a broad membership base. And that has become very serious about this issue and is approaching it in a number of ways, but did a membership survey to kind of get take the pulse of how people in general felt. And there was some support, but there was also some pretty strong negative feedback. But it was apparent when you read those comments that it was all from a place of seeing it from a political perspective and affiliating it with a political view that people either agreed or did not agree with, right? So for us as in that organization, I think it's about tying it to the business imperative of why it is that this issue is being approached. For us at A&T, and specifically in my college, in the Deese College, it's interesting. We're a little bit different organization, being a historically Black university. We have not traditionally thought so much about us having DEI issues because we've thought of ourselves as helping other people solve their DEI issues, right? Helping them to diversify their organizations. And so now as we, kind of have expanded our idea and our thinking of what this space is about, just it's taking some education just to get people to understand that this is something we do need to think about and approach. But again, for me, a lot has been, again, tying to our business purpose and our business strategy. So our ultimate bottom line, like our biggest strategy, is around the success of our students. And to that end, we have very clear metrics that we've agreed to target for how many students will retain in year one, how many will retain in year two, how many will graduate in 4 years, 5 years, 6 years. Clear business metrics. And then helping people understand. So we're 89% Black African American in my college, but it's helping people understand that we can't have 11% of our students perhaps not perform at their best because they don't feel like it's an inclusive environment for them. We can't do that and meet our metrics. If we have a group of people who we are not effectively facilitating the success of these students because they happen to not be straight or they happen to not be cisgender, we just can't meet the metrics. And so it's a business imperative at that point. It's not a political issue. So I think just defining the business imperative and using that to sort of create alignment helps with buy-in over time.
Thank you for sharing that, Kevin. I particularly appreciate you talking about the business imperative and tying to your organization's greater purpose and mission. We hear a lot from folks. In fact, I've heard this from our own CEO. How do we get our apathetic majority on board, right? And so that's a great lesson learned from your own organization there. All right, Amy, I think we have another poll, second to last one. Thanks everyone for hanging in with us with all the CPE for a long session today.
All right, the fifth polling question. My organization could improve our DEI focus on A, recruiting, B, mid-career advancement and career development, C, leadership representation, or D, policies and procedures. And once you've completed your CPE requirements, you will be able to download a PDF of your certificate from the CPE progress window in your console. All right, here are the results.
We are almost evenly split on these results. And that probably says that organizations, when we think about one of our prior responses where folks were, kind of just early on, we're on the right track, but we're pretty early in our DEI journey, this makes sense. So yeah, we all have a lot of work to do, and we're all in different spots on our journeys. So Michelle, we just talked about getting buy-in from your colleagues. What about a situation when you've had resistance to DEI efforts, when we wanted to do work and folks have been actively pushing back on the work? How did you and your team respond to that?
Oh, thank you for the question. We need to realize that emotions are a tricky trait to navigate, and race in the U.S. is a highly charged issue. People will tend to crawl over broken glass to avoid shame. So much of what has been inflicted on others over the course of 400 years is quite shameful. People avoid being uncomfortable, even if it is on the road to positive change. So how do we handle this? Listen. Create spaces of listening. Create spaces where it is safe as one can be, to make mistakes. To admit, as the DEI director, for instance, we have an equity book club. We are reading the book, The Sum of Us by Heather McGhee. It is a highly recommended book as well as a highly charged book. And there are times that I've actually told my equity book club members, which are our employees, I've had to throw this book across the room a few times because it was hard for me. And then what I see, at least on camera, because we're still working remotely, is, oh, okay, if it was hard for you, then I'm not going to. And I said, yes, we're going to take it as, small baby steps. And then I also ask our leadership, who are also part of the Equity Book Club, not to dominate the conversation, but tell stories of when it was hard for them. So we all realize how human we are. And we are currently working on helping our philanthropic services advisors on how to talk to our donors to bring them along on our equity journey. Because many of them, that's not something that might not even be part of the conversation. And giving them the tools to include equity in their conversations so that there is another choice. So that's just a few tidbits.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think we all are going to be experiencing this and on this particular part of the journey for some time. So I appreciate those. Okay, Amy, can we run our final poll of the day?
All right, so our last polling question is, which of these inclusive behaviors is most evident in your organization? A, going out of the way to make others feel welcome. B, making efforts to uncover opposing or alternative views in order to try to better understand and solve problems. C, resolving conflicts effectively. D, standing up for others. Or E, giving team members the benefit of the doubt.
We wanted to end our polls on a positive note. Modeling inclusive behaviors, like Erwin said.
All right, we'll leave this up another 5 seconds to make sure everyone that needs CPE can get it. All right, here are the results.
All right. So going out of the way to make others feel welcome, that's our runaway winner. That's great. What a great thing to be proud of in your organizations. I think these are all really wonderful answers. And thinking about, those behaviors that you didn't answer, thinking about how you as a member of your own leadership team or organization can bring back to your team as well. Okay, so last up, formal questions for our panel. My personal favorite topic, governance. Brenda, we've touched on boards throughout this topic, and I think this is particularly important for those of us who are mission-driven entities. How do you engage your board members, others involved in governance in DEI?
Sure thing. Thanks, Colleen. So I'll just start off by saying that the work has to be done at all levels. What we have witnessed in our journey is that it was very much staff initiated, and without them, this work would not have happened. However, we're at a stage in our development where the board is walking alongside us. They did a assessment, and it wasn't just about diversity, equity, inclusion. There was other components to it, but they co-created a self-assessment with a consultant to take inventory of where they were at, what needed to be worked on. So I think that's a really important thing. I heard Jean speak about that as well. But just for everybody to sit down and say, what, I think Michelle spoke to that earlier as well, as what, having those conversations is very important at the board level. We've done trainings, combined trainings with staff and board, and I will say mixed results. So do what works best for your organization. There's obviously a power dynamic that exists, and so it's better at times for staff to be able to do their own training, be able to exercise the whole process without having the board in the same room. But there's also value for them to be together. So we've been trying a variety. And as I said before, we've had some mixed results. Recently, we went through a training at the staff level, and we recorded just the presentation piece of it. So not the breakout group sessions where there was private information and dialogue being shared. And so the board was able to watch the presentation. And so then when they had theirs, they had their own breakout sessions with their own group. So it was nice to kind of see how this took place, that they were able to participate in some ways at the same, but then have their own conversation about it. So that was interesting, and we'll continue to work towards that. The other piece of it is engaging the board, to what Kevin said, on broader issues around DEI. It's not just about the grant making, so we're a private foundation. There are the operational pieces, there are the governance pieces, and then there's also how we interact with our external partners. So I mentioned this before. We talk about DEI in other areas of our business on a routine basis. So it just is threaded throughout the organization. So it's not just heavily weighted on the grant making side, because it's important to know that this work benefits all aspects of the business. It benefits all folks in the organization. And so the more that topic is discussed and prioritized at the board level, it sets a very appropriate tone at the top to say that this does matter and that it is a continued priority for the organization.
Thank you for sharing that and acknowledging the power dynamic, which is definitely at play. Some of us have, elected and appointed boards, so it can be even more complicated. I serve on a board where we've done a tremendous amount of DEI training over the last couple of years. Some of it has been collaborative with staff. Even just acknowledging the power dynamic at the start of the training can help to diffuse a little bit of it. What we find a lot is that the staff is ahead of us, right? The staff is, they're engaged in the work on a daily basis. They're program folks, and we're the board, and we come in for our board meetings and we talk about, where do we want to be? Oh, wow, you're doing a great job, right? And we need to catch up to them. And acknowledging that was a big lesson learned for us. Kevin, how about at your institution? How are you engaging with your board?
Yeah. So as I listen to Brenda and your remarks, I think one of the things that's really important is having, if you can, DEI expertise on your board, right? So for me, leading our college, it's understanding that I know some things about DEI, but I'm not an expert in DEI. I'm not a Michelle. I'm not an Erwin, right? So I need certain voices that I'm hearing from, and I need certain people in the room when we're talking about strategy and talking about how we're moving forward, who will make sure that they bring those issues to the forefront. So we are fortunate to have on our board a couple of folks, the Director of Inclusiveness Recruiting for EY, as well as the Chief DEI Officer for McDonald's on our board. And so, having them in the room to have those conversations, also being able to run into an issue where I doubt, and I can call someone and say, hey, help me think this through. In addition to, they plan to take a bit more hands-on role for us this coming academic year, just in helping us really approach looking at where we are in a deeper way, assessing and figuring out our gaps and helping us figure out how to go forward. Do some things that on our staff we don't have the expertise to know how to take some of those next steps. So just having that expertise available, that to leverage, I think is really important.
Yeah, that's great. Using your board members and putting them to work, right? We volunteer for a reason, so that's good. As long as you don't tire us out too much, I think that's important. Okay, so we have a little bit of time for questions in the Q&A. We've gotten quite a few. I wanted to start with one just about DEI metrics. So for those of you who have put some measurable outcomes in place and are tracking metrics related to DEI, I'd love to hear about what you have put in place, what targets you might be tracking, any lessons learned from actually collecting and reporting data around DEI.
I can reference a few metrics that we're looking at because our social justice, equity, and inclusion is part of our strategic plan. Among the things that we're doing is we're checking, we're doing some assessments of perceptions. We're doing some assessments of the voice and representation. And so it's actually on our website, which I could perhaps share with you. But we have, for example, among the things we have 216 campus diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. Our goal is 250 by 2030, I believe. We have 24 campus areas that have diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. Our goal is that overall we'll have 30 of those. We've got a goal of participation. One of these is what is the faculty and staff perception of UNLV's emphasis on diversity? That goal is that's at a 3.3 on a scale of 1 to 4 right now through a survey, and our goal is to get that to 3.6, 90th percentile. What's the percentage of students that agree that we are providing support for differing backgrounds? Our goal is 68%, and as of now, we're at 63%. So those are just a few, but we have a whole page of these metrics that we have that go along with our strategic plan.
Thank you, Jean. Are any other panelists actually collecting and measuring any data?
We are beginning to look at our vendors and identify to diversify our vendor pool. And so that is something that we are tracking. We are also tracking the makeup of our leadership team, our managing director team, and our staff to make sure that there is not only equity and inclusion, but it makes sense that the makeup of our staff, which is very diverse, also reflects the makeup of our management team.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. So that actually leads to the next question that I was going to ask, actually. You know, we focus a lot on recruitment because it's an easy thing to track, and I think it's you can make really quick progress. Leadership development and that pull through to have our leadership teams actually reflect our staff and our communities is much more challenging. So any thoughts in terms of lessons learned there, mentorship, sponsorship, things like that in your organizations to create more diverse leadership teams?
I would say maybe adjacent to that, staff have created affinity groups where there are leadership development within those groups. It's something that anyone can initiate, belong to, and we've definitely seen some very creative ways in which folks have utilized these groups. I happen to be in the white affinity group, and we utilize that to do training that's maybe specific to us and where our roadblocks and blind spots might be, and we can do it in a way, as Michelle alluded to earlier, in a safe space, so that we're not burdening our colleagues of color to teach and train us. But that's one area that we have interested to hear from others.
Thanks, Brenda. Anybody else?
We have 2 affinity groups and a DEI council. Our DEI council has representatives from each department, 2 representatives from each department. One of the things we're most proud of is our land acknowledgement was actually created by the DEI council, and most recently our holiday policy, which is far more inclusive and allows people to choose which holidays are most important to them as compared to the traditional, if you will, Christian-based holidays, because our staff is so diverse. We have our office closure days, which pretty much mirror the federal holidays, if you will, but people can choose out and substitute. I want Groundhog's Day instead of Memorial Day, just as an example. So that's also, we think, is also contributing to a more inclusive and belonging environment.
Thank you.
I'll add that at UNLV, in addition to some of the affinity group efforts, which I think are a great way to help with professional development, we also have the President's Fellows Program, and that's a leadership development initiative that creates pathways for people throughout our employees to develop administrative experience. And the objectives include providing emerging and aspirational leaders the opportunity to get senior level administrative experience. And it's also, a goal is to increase the diversity of perspectives and ideas within the administration, and of course also the diversity of the type of talent that we have that's ready for senior leadership roles.
Thank you for sharing that, Jean. A formal program is a great opportunity. Okay, so we had a question in our Q&A box about where our funds come from to invest in DEI work. I think this is a great question for all of these different organizations, right? We're resource constrained, social and mission driven entities. So it'd be great to hear how you identified how to fund these programs. Erwin, maybe we can start with you.
Sure. Yeah. For us, DEI is a major strategic priority, and so when you think about the organization operating overall, like it's funded just by our general operations. My budget is housed in the people department, but it's funded from the entire organizational budget, and so which really makes it clear that it's a strategic priority and not placed off to the side in some separate bucket.
Thank you. Michelle, at the Seattle Foundation, how did you identified you're going to be anti-racist, and then what did you do in the budget to reflect that?
The budget for DEI resides in the President's office, mainly because we think that DEI basically covers everyone, and so many of other operational activities that involve everyone resides in the President's office. HR has their budget, and HR in our organization is housed under finance and operations, but DEI resides in the President's budget. And my boss, the Chief of Staff, my cohort, the Senior Racial Equity Advisor, as well as myself, set the budget not only for DEI work, but also help set the budget for our affinity groups as well. And our affinity groups now have their own budgets to decide how they want to spend and improve themselves over the course of a year.
Excellent. Autonomous affinity group budgets. That's great. Kevin, how about in your institution?
Yeah, so for us, there are some things that this is a strategic priority of the university. And so there are some things that are being done at the university level that our college can tap into and leverage. To the extent that we're doing things at the college level, for the most part, it has to be done out of discretionary funds where we've done fundraising to say, okay, we're just going to allocate funds to things that are of priority. Being a state-funded school, and there are a couple of places where, so for example, I can allocate state funds to summer research grants when someone's specifically studying a topic or doing a paper on something that advances either DEI in their discipline, which we do, or that helps us understand how we can approach these issues more. So we use some state funds for those kinds of things. But for the most part, it's just setting a priority that some of our discretionary funds are going to be used in that way.
Great, thank you. And I saved the two CFOs for last because I knew they would have the most to say. So Brenda, would you like to answer that question?
So we have a discrete budget for DEI, and I will say that has not always been the case, and that was really a big moment when we signaled this gets its own carve out for the budget, and it reports to the executive, so to our CEO. So similar to what has been stated before, it's embedded throughout the organization. So it is obviously a priority, but it's part of the landscape, it's part of the foundation at this point, and you know, it's just normal, I guess, business that it is prioritized. I will say from an affinity perspective, all the affinity groups get a budget. That's through the HR arm as well. From a funder's perspective, I would say for those, we also on the grant making side do grants for this very specific reason, and it's a big priority for us. And so I know that, as I stated before, we are in a privileged position where we do have resources, and it is absolutely important that resources be given for this work. It cannot happen by wishing or bootstrapping and asking staff to do. And so that is a really valid question of where does the money come and how do you get it? And we see that to be important on both sides, internally as well as our external community partners.
Thank you, Brenda. Okay, Jean, last up, where does your money come from?
Well, a few years ago, I think it was in 2017 when we first created the Office of Diversity Initiatives and hired that vice president for diversity and the chief diversity officer. We did create line items in our budget, but these are difficult decisions, you know, when you have, as we all do, when you have strained resources, but it was defined as part of our strategic plan, and therefore that our strategic plan helps us prioritize our budget. So we set up the budget at that time. We have a lot of things that didn't get funded in any given year, but we've been able to fund that consistently now for over 5 years. We also have an operating budget and some staff support. I will say that some of the initiatives that we're doing are funded using one-time funds that we have available. Every year we end up with some small amount of one-time funds, and we use those to prioritize maybe some of the special initiatives. Sometimes those are pilot programs, and if they are things that we want to continue, then we have to figure out how to build those into the budget. But this comes from our operating budget, and it's built in. It's part of the president's office. I think somebody else had mentioned that. It does report up through the president, so there is a separate budget, and it is a direct report to the president.
Thank you. Well, on that note, I know we had a lot more questions in the Q&A box, and we will follow up with everyone who did submit a question. Amy, I'm going to pass it over to you to wrap up. Thank you to all of our panelists, and thank you to everyone who attended today.
All right, thank you, Colleen, and thank you to all of our panelists for a great discussion today, and thank you to our audience for being engaged and submitting your questions to help guide today's conversation. We do have quite a bit of resources available on our website, including our newly released 2021 Inclusion and Diversity Report. That's also linked in your console. And then also, if you met all CPE requirements, your certificate is available to download now in the CPE progress window. I will keep the console open for a few minutes to give you time to download, and a copy will be emailed within 3 weeks should you have difficulty downloading it now. And finally, here is a link to an online survey where you can provide feedback for today's presentation. And thank you for joining us. Take care, everyone.